The final season has come and gone, leaving only the faintest whiff of something that's turned slightly sour. Here's how the last leg of the journey played out. We met some new aliens this season, and regularly pissed on their rights to self-governance in their own space. The Doc upended a whole social structure in critical care, and Janeway herself got involved in conflict between some Talaxians and a group of miners, despite saying in the same episode that she can't. In short, we've done pretty much the same as the last 6 seasons. I'm beginning to think all Starfleet cadets just cross their fingers behind their backs when they swear to uphold the Prime Directive. Elsewhere, the crew of Voyager finally got to make proper phone calls with people back home. Well, briefly, anyway, both in terms of call length and only having it for a handful of episodes before we arrived at Earth. Still, I suppose it's the thought that counts. And Kim got cut off, so it was worth it for that. Let's cast our eyes one final time over the crew's personal progress and see what portion of the pie this season served them. Workforce showed us a potential Janeway outside of Starfleet, and a rare example of her being genuinely contented. It's just a blip on the badass road though, and we soon return to Kaboom Town, so much so that the alternate timeline version of herself commits regicide. That it likely also resulted in the deaths of billions of captives mars the moral question somewhat, but it's hardly the first time we've realised her actions are monstrous with a little consideration. At least she gets to pin all that on a time clone in the official report. Natural law saw Chakotay place his personal interests over what's best for all, a repeat of his actions in one small step from the last season. And just like that episode, we saw the opportunity to explore him be sidetracked in favour of giving more screen time to Seven. That's not an insult to the character of Seven or the skills of Jeri Ryan, both of which have proven themselves time and again. But that's my point. They're proven. Regularly. Chakotay, on the other hand, has been chronically underused for the whole series run, and this is another example of that. The closest he got to playing lead fiddle this season was in Time Fuckery episode Shattered, and frankly, that was a role that could have been played by any of the crew. It's also the low point of the season for me, despite not being an outright stinker. Voyager's premier Hercule Poirot cosplayer got the chance to live the dream this season, solving the crimes he himself committed in repression. The logic behind all of that was bollocks, of course, but I welcome most episodes that remind us about the Marquis being a thing. Workforce also gave Tim Russ another chance to break from the stoic character again, albeit one more restrained and coloured by the mannerisms of Tuvok than what we saw in Riddles last season. Some points to him for pitching the right level of subtlety required to make that work. Swings and roundabouts with Paris this season. Drive showed us he's still a bit of a dick sometimes, but that's now tempered by his willingness to accept criticism and be open. He also got married and became a dad, even seeking out advice on the latter from Tuvok. The thought of him expressing a lack of expertise in anything would have been absurd only a few seasons back, never mind actively looking for help, and the growth on display is pleasing. Ensign Harry Kim got us fucked in Season 7 as he has been for the other 6. 26 more episodes where we essentially waste the presence of Garrett Wang, whose surname I recently learned I'd been mispronouncing for years, by the way. There was a tiny spurt of character in Lineage where he both made a joke and explained to Paris precisely why he was a dick, but there might as well not have been. As soon as the episode was over, that progress was taken out back and buried next to the other couple of times he showed promise. We could point at Nightingale, but there's no point. As I explained in the summary of that episode, his behaviour in it was all but a carbon copy of the fuck up then fix it line used in Warhead 2 seasons prior. What a waste. A fair bit of family stuff with B'Elanna this season, both her old one and the one she's starting herself. Drive had her finally getting Paris to be serious about Shed, only for it to turn out that he was being casual for her. Well, that's what he said anyway. It all turned out well enough for her to get both wed and up the duff, which itself was a doorway to trauma. Not the act of conception, though I imagine that was too, but dealing with the shitty way she was treated as a kid in Lineage. Still, her dad being a grade A cockend didn't stop her taking a call from him in Author. The resulting start on the path of reconciliation, the same experience Paris was having with his own father, proves that sometimes the best thing you can do with family is to be 30,000 light years away from them. I imagine many of us can relate. A bumper crop again for the Doc, and quite a varied one too. Threatening to kill a guy in critical care, succumbing to the temptation of indulgence in body and soul, and just straight-up deserting in flesh and blood. Capping off all of that was another step on his path to autonomy, attempting to be classified as a Federation citizen in Author. He failed in the attempt, though a more accurate assessment would be that the Federation failed him. On the plus side, a glimpse at Joe the Future Doc in the show's finale suggests that it's just a matter of time. A bit part in Homestead and a nod in Endgame. Despite being one of Voyager's most interesting characters, Naomi was largely ignored this season. A shame, but not entirely unexpected, as it's similar to what we saw in the last season. Farewell, Naomi. You can rest safe in the knowledge that you were more interesting than at least 2 of the regulars. On the scale of characters getting fucked over, the Borgettes must be pretty near the top. They were simply dismissed right at the start of Imperfection, a packed lunch and a pat on the back as they're carted off so Gin and Tonic can be with their own kind. Mazzotti didn't even get that, but went with them anyway. Still, at least Ramrod got to stay on board, and I'm sure everything will turn out marvellously for him. A generous selection again for Jerry Ryan, and not all about 7. Body and Soul gave her a chance to stretch with some Doc body swap shenanigans, points richly deserved for the study of Picardo's mannerisms. Elsewhere we had an, in my opinion, needless exploration of relationships. We could point out that she'd already covered this previously, but I've warmed to the idea that she'd revisit it as she became more comfortable with exploring that aspect of herself. What bothers me now, on reflection, is how utterly rushed it was, the entire thing spanning just a pair of episodes, and one of those was a fantasy. It's not a story arc if there are only 2 points of data. That's just a straight line. Him not being here at the end might disappoint some, and I can see the reasons behind that, but for the character, the ending he got is more satisfying. His whole arc has been about coming to terms with the loss of his family and finding a new one. If he'd arrived back in the Alpha Quadrant, then yeah, that'd be all interesting and shit, but then what? The Voyager crew aren't still going to hang around with each other every day. It'd be the inevitable slow-motion destruction of his adoptive family. Being able to settle allowed him to find a sense of belonging that he may have struggled to find on Earth. We could probably have a chat about the unintended implication that people are happier with their own kind, but I think Neelix himself covered that by initially telling them to get fucked if they weren't going to let his friends visit. Ultimately, it's a happy ending for him, and hopefully one where he's now better equipped to be a far less toxic partner than he was when he joined us. As to the season itself, it could probably be best described as middling. There were no true stinkers, but there's certainly the hint of stagnation starting to creep in. That said, Repentant managed to be above average in my opinion, and the rest was still perfectly serviceable. It's quite telling, though, that I don't think anything from this season will be featuring in my top 5, despite the show having had a full 6 years to establish most of the characters by this point. And those established characters, barring Neelix anyway, were all given gold watches and told to sod off very abruptly at the end. No indication of how Starfleet will handle their return, no look at what happened to any of them after they got back. Some watching might argue that the future portions of the finale were just this, but there's a very real difference between getting back after 7 years and getting back after 23. How crimes against the Federation by Marquis members will be handled, for example, could be treated very differently as a result. This is perhaps the greatest disappointment of the season. It just ends. There's no epilogue and no chance for closure as a result. Each of those plot threads, with the exception of Neelix, feels loose. For a series that showed us the lives of characters for 7 years, it's difficult to not see that as a failure. Perhaps it was deliberate, an attempt to leave the show with something to come back to if it was ever requested. Perhaps the writers had a long list of things they wanted to show the viewer and were shut down by people above them. Perhaps everybody just decided they'd had their fill. The end result is still the same, a feeling of something missing. In that respect, you could argue it's a fitting finale to the show after all. And that, my friends, is that. Except not quite. There's one more video on the topic of Voyager we're going to do before we move on, an examination of the show as a whole to see where it shined and where it could have perhaps used a bit more polish. We'll stick in a top 5 too, and maybe the 5 biggest turds as well. It might be fun to see how my lists compare with that of people in the comments. As ever, the names currently sauntering sexily up the screen are those who've been willing to throw currency at me in exchange for the promise of more videos. My heartfelt thanks go to all of them, and indeed to you, dear viewer. But mainly to them, obviously, because, money, which I think is fair. Speaking of which, if you're an admiral on the USS Pedant, or considering it, then pop over to Patreon. We'll be moving on to Deep Space Nine soon, so it's time to think about what recurring character you want to claim as your own. Two particularly enterprising souls have already nabbed Kywin and Garak, but it's DS9, so there's loads of the buggers. End of summary.